Today, we're looking at the issues of protest and resistance. And sometimes this attracts a lot of attention, international attention. You may have cameras on the scene, you may have reporters on the scene, bringing that not just to audiences throughout China, but beyond China. That's less common today for all sorts of reasons, including some of the regulations about citizen reporting, about putting things up that haven't passed through proper channels. So that's perhaps a little bit less apparent, but protests continue. How do we talk about them? Do we talk about protests? Do we talk about mass incidents? Do we talk about riots? Given our recent history in the United States, we know that nomenclature matters on these things. What drives these protests? What animates them? What are the key issues that are being debated, where people have seen fit to sit down, stand up, block some sort of action, these kinds of things? How do they develop? How do these protests develop? How do they change? What impact do they have on the protesters themselves, on the specific issue, on the target of the protest, and on wider audiences, including us? So to learn more about protests and resistance, we're fortunate to have Professor Teresa Wright with us. She's a longtime friend of the USC U.S.-China Institute and is a leading authority on this subject. She was educated in California at Santa Clara University and at Berkeley, and she's taught at Cal State University, Long Beach for quite some time and is a truly valued faculty member. In fact, she has received one of the awards that I've never heard of any school offering. In 2019, she was named the College of Liberal Arts Most Valuable Professor. In a moment, you're going to see why she earned that title. Her research into this field is deep. She's published widely on the subject and is the author of numerous books. Her first book was The Perils of Protest, looking at state repression and student activism in both China and Taiwan. She subsequently wrote Accepting Authoritarianism, State and Society Relations in the Reform Era. And she's written a book, Party and State in Post-Mao China. More recently, she published Popular Protest in China and has recently edited a valuable handbook on protest and resistance in China. We couldn't do better than to get Professor Teresa Wright here to talk about this very important subject. Professor Wright, the floor is yours.
For starters, I just want to lead in by assuming that you all pay attention to the news, including about China. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be here today. And if you do pay attention to the news, you are certainly well aware that China's Communist Party-led government has many features that we would consider to be authoritarian and oppressive. Similarly, you might have the impression that Chinese citizens are obedient toward their government and fearful of their government, given its authoritarian and repressive tendencies and practices. Well, you might be a little less aware that China's political system also has numerous features that I think we would agree are really democratic, according to some definitions of the word, and that China's political system also has numerous participatory mechanisms, institutionalized participatory mechanisms. In addition to that, you may not be aware, well, you are if you just listened to Clay's introduction, but you may not be aware that Chinese citizens are quite vociferous, quite outspoken, in articulating their grievances and in pressing political authorities to address their concerns. And they do this including through boisterous and sometimes even violent street protests. The Chinese government, in fact, 10 or so years ago, stopped making public the number of mass incidents or popular protests that occurred every year, because the number was getting to be close to 90,000 every year. And our best guess is that there have continued to be, through the present time, in the high tens of thousands of protests in China every year. On top of that, kind of going against what we think of as the Chinese political system's authoritarian and repressive nature, government authorities, and particularly those at higher levels of the political system, have not infrequently taken action to actually respond in a positive way to citizen complaints and to address citizens' demands. So, what do we make of all of this complexity? And this slide might take you a little bit by surprise. I'm showing you a giant elephant. And the reason that I do this is because I think this image helps us remember the complexity of the Chinese political system. And you may have heard the old parable, I don't know what you'd call it, of people come and it's a dark room and there's an elephant in, and everybody touches the elephant in a different place and they describe what they're feeling, and they're all describing wildly different things, but it's the same item or object, the elephant. So I think the elephant also is a good way to think of China's political system. Almost everything that you might say about the political system is true depending on what aspect you're looking at. So even in just what I was saying by way of introduction, China's political system is authoritarian. It is oppressive. It is also democratic in some ways. It allows for popular participation in some ways. And in some ways, the Chinese government is responsive and attempts to address the demands of the populace. So when you think of China, don't think in simplistic terms. Don't think authoritarian, repressive. Think of the elephant. Okay, so how do we explain all of this complexity? I think the best way to understand why there is this complexity in China's political system is that the top goal of top Chinese Communist Party leaders is to maintain the political dominance of the Chinese Communist Party. And I assume most of you in this audience have seen this abbreviation before, CCP. I use it to refer to the Chinese Communist Party, as is commonly done. So, how do you make sense of both the authoritarian and the responsive features of the Chinese political system? Both of these seemingly contradictory features actually emanate from this singular goal to maintain the political power of the Chinese Communist Party. So let's talk a little bit more about protest. When you look at all of these tens of thousands of protests that occur in China in a given year, I think you can find patterns in all of these protests. I only have 20 or 30 minutes to speak. I don't have time to talk about each individual protest among tens of thousands of protests. But as a scholar, what I try to do is look at all of these thousands of protests and try to kind of look for patterns among them. So what I see when I look at all of these protests is that there's a real distinction between protests that occur in what we might call sort of the heartland of the People's Republic of China, which includes, on this map that you're seeing here, the kind of lighter green, the China's 23 regular provinces, mainly populated by Han Chinese. So the protests that we see here are of one type, and they contrast with protests that we see in China's autonomous regions, such as Xinjiang, where a large portion of the population is of the Uyghur ethnicity and Muslim in terms of religion, Tibet, and then Hong Kong, which is very small on this map, but you can see here it is a special autonomous region. So when you look at all these thousands of protests in China in a given year and over time, I think it's helpful to distinguish between the type of protest that you see in the Chinese kind of heartland and in the special autonomous regions. So I want to talk a little bit about these two types of protests. So the first type are the protests, again, in those lighter green areas of the map that I just showed you in China's provinces, predominantly Han Chinese. In this type of protest, there's all different kinds of topics. Many different kinds of demographic groups have collectively engaged in contention. One major segment of this type of protests are labor protests. Those have included state sector workers, but predominantly in more recent years, private sector workers. Some of the main complaints of private sector workers have been unpaid wages or back wages, also living conditions, including poor food in the factory cafeteria. And these labor protests have, in many cases, been peaceful and law-abiding. In many cases, have involved spontaneous strikes. In some cases, have occurred with some aid from labor non-governmental organizations. So many thousands of fairly small-scale labor protests in China every year. Those have also included teacher strikes, truck driver strikes, taxi and Uber-style driver strikes. A second category of protests have mainly been rural, and those have mostly been over unfair land acquisitions in the countryside, where villagers have risen up in protest. A third major component of this type of protest has included environmental protests. And I understand that you've already had a whole session on environmental activism, so you can kind of plug that session in here. Environmental protests include reactive protests, where the population is protesting against environmental degradation, typically in their locality, and also proactive protests, such as the one that you see here, protests against a paraxylene plant or plans to build a paraxylene plant in the locality, and as a result, pollute the environment. A fourth major category within this, what I call type 1 protests, are protests on the part of homeowners. Those have included people who own units in buildings that have been slated for demolition to make way for higher priced housing, but also protests on the part of wealthier urban Chinese who have bought expensive units in new housing tracts. And when what they were promised does not pan out in reality or is threatened, then we have seen protests on the part of more wealthy urban homeowners as well. We've also seen thousands of protests on the part of military veterans. And again, all of these have mainly occurred in the main 23 provinces within China. Now, this type of protest has certain characteristics, regardless of whether we're talking about private sector workers or farmers in the countryside or wealthy homeowners. All of these protests and what I call type 1 protests have some things in common. So one thing that they have in common is that their demands tend to be material demands, sort of concrete, non-political demands. So workers, they want their wages paid. They want better quality food. Farmers that have had their land taken, they want higher compensation for the land that was confiscated. Environmental protests, they don't want the paraxylene plant built, or they want the land or waterways that have been degraded to be cleaned up. homeowner protests, the wealthy homeowners, if they bought a unit in a tract that had a very beautiful park next door, and now the park is going to be removed and a new housing tract is going to be built there. The homeowners don't want the park to be removed. So very concrete demands. Veterans typically have asked for better pension and other kind of social safety net support. So all different kinds of protests, different kinds of demographic groups, but what they've had in common is material, non-political demands. Second commonality that we see in what I call these type 1 protests is that they look to central authorities as benefactors, as the source of resolving their problems. And oftentimes they point to laws that appear to support their claims. And in fact, if you look, for example, at Chinese labor laws, if you look at them on the books, they're quite progressive. They're some of the most progressive labor laws in the world. So aggrieved private sector workers will say, hey, my employer is not abiding by this good national law, and will look to higher level authorities to simply enforce the law that they themselves have put on the books. Same thing is true with protests related to land requisitions. There are laws and policies and statements made by central leaders that rural dwellers look to support them in their claims. You heard more about environmental activism, and there are also environmental laws on the books that environmental activists point to as they try to appeal to higher level authorities to support them. And the same generally is true for military veterans. Now, in terms of how does the government respond to this type of protest, the response is very mixed. In quite a few cases, the concrete material demands of the protesters are met at least in part. So government authorities might lean on an employer to pay those back wages, or at least pay part of those back wages. Perhaps farmers who've had their land confiscated and don't feel that they got sufficient compensation will get a little more in compensation. In some cases, as a result of environmental protests, the building of a plant like a paraxylene plant will be postponed or abandoned altogether. So in quite a few cases, the government is responsive at the same time, responsive in a positive way, but at the same time, this is mixed with different kinds of repression. Oftentimes the leaders of the protests, even if some of the demands of the protesters are met, oftentimes the leaders are repressed, arrested, they might get fired. And in some cases, the protests as a whole are suppressed with violent force. So the government response has been very mixed. In some cases as well, the government over time, if it sees thousands of protests on the same topic, the government has actually changed national level policy to respond to the grievances that they have seen expressed on the ground. That's partly why Chinese labor laws have evolved in the way that they have. Same thing with environmental laws and laws with regard to land requisition. Now, why would there be this mixed response? Well, it goes back to the overall goal of Chinese political authorities, which is to maintain Chinese Communist Party power. So if protesters are making material demands and are saying that the national laws that are good in their eyes are not being followed by local political authorities or local employers, this isn't threatening to top Chinese Communist Party leaders. In fact, to the contrary, if Chinese Communist Party leaders can respond effectively to these material demands and grievances and develop new laws and policies and perhaps give some compensation to the protesters, that actually has the effect of enhancing the legitimacy of Chinese Communist Party rule, of increasing popular support for a perpetuation of the political status quo. Now, at the same time, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't want to encourage more protests, and that helps to explain why the leaders of the protests are often punished, and or street protests that might get out of control and then be seen as threatening to political stability will be repressed, while at the same time, the regime is responding in a sympathetic way and trying to improve its governance through its response to these protests. Okay, so that was talking about what I call type 1 protests that occur in the kind of heartland of the People's Republic of China in its main provinces, predominantly populated by Han Chinese. What about the other type, protests that we've seen in Xinjiang or by people who are from Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong? These are what I call type 2 protests. So these protests are very different. In these protests, the demands are political. They're not material. And in fact, the demands, even though they're different, again, protesters in Tibet and protesters in Xinjiang are very different, especially from protesters in Hong Kong in many respects, very different societies, etc., cultures. But what they all have in common is that their demands are political, calling for greater political autonomy, greater self-determination, greater independence from Chinese Communist Party rule. So the wheels are turning. You're saying, well, Chinese Communist Party authorities aren't going to like that because their overall goal is to maintain the power of the Chinese Communist Party. And you're right. The other commonality among these, a second commonality among these protesters that really differentiates them from what I call type 1 protests is that rather than looking to central authorities as a source of support or pointing to national laws as something that are good but have been violated or have not been implemented by local authorities, it's the opposite in this case. For these protesters, the target of their criticism is central authorities themselves, and in many cases, policies that have been created by central authorities. Think of the extradition law in Hong Kong. That is a policy passed by the central Chinese Communist Party-led regime, and that is was the target of the protests in 2019 in Hong Kong. In Tibet and Xinjiang, the protests are against policies that are suppressing and have been for many years suppressing religious practice, the use of language, etc., in Tibet and Xinjiang. So really the opposite of the kind of dynamic that you see in type 1 protests, where the central authorities are looked to as benefactors and local authorities are criticized. In these type 2 protests in Tibet and Xinjiang and Hong Kong, the criticism is aimed at central level authorities and central level policies. So the government response, not surprisingly, has been repression. Really not a mixed response in the way that we've seen in the type 1 protests. And that's because, again, the top goal of the Chinese Communist authorities is to maintain the power of the Chinese Communist Party. So in protests like these, where the complaint is too much power for the Chinese Communist Party, there is no tolerance, no support, and no sympathy, and simply no desire to respond in a positive way to these protests. So, what can I say in conclusion? Again, if you want to make sense of the complexity of China as symbolized by the idea of China as the elephant, where many different things are true of the Chinese political system at the same time, even when they seem to be contradictory, the way to make sense of this complexity is to remember that the number one goal of the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party is to maintain the power of the party. And this imperative or this goal leads Chinese Communist Party authorities to try to respond sympathetically and effectively to citizen protests and citizen demands that are material in nature and do not contest the legitimacy or the dominance of the Chinese Communist Party. And when the Communist Party does respond effectively to this kind of more material-based protest, it actually enhances the legitimacy of the regime. And then in marked contrast, when you see protests that question or challenge the dominance of the Chinese Communist Party or ask for greater autonomy from Chinese Communist Party control, then the response of the regime is harsh and unmitigated repression. So that concludes my talk.
Teresa, thank you so much. That was wonderfully systematic, clear. It's the reason why you are most valuable professor at Cal State Long Beach and longtime head of the political science department. I'd like you to wear that political scientist hat. You've been wearing it, but put it back on and let me ask the question about responsiveness. And others have said something similar to what you've said, that China is an authoritarian, autocratic state, but it's also a responsive one. And you highlighted that particularly in your comments about the type 1 protests. I was wondering if you could drill down a little bit. And you made some mention about labor law and these kinds of things, but maybe you could expand on the kinds of responses that have emanated from either the local or the center to protests that manifest this responsive authoritarianism.
Sure, and I want to highlight too, even when you even the term responsive authoritarianism, or there's also people use the term adaptive or resilient authoritarianism. That in some ways that seems oxymoronic, right? It seems like a contradiction in terms, especially responsive authoritarianism. So it is a mix, and I don't want to give the impression that higher level authorities are always just having their ear to the ground and wanting to help and never engaging in any kind of repressive actions. Maybe I can give you an example of kind of how a typical protest would progress. Typically, the first stop for aggrieved citizens, and this is for the type 1 protests, not for type 2 protests. For type 1 protests, typically the first stop is the letters and visit system, which has been around since the time of Mao, and it's one of the basic participatory mechanisms that is an institutionalized part of the Chinese political system. So really every government entity or party state related entity has a letters and visits office where any citizen or groups of citizens can go to lodge a complaint. Those offices are required to respond to those complaints and investigate them. Well, typically, if the complaint is against a local authority, let's say a few villagers go down and lodge a complaint. If the complaint's against a local authority, the local authority, the village leaders, let's say in this case, don't want that to happen because they don't want higher level authorities to find out that people aren't happy in the area under their purview. So they might try to prevent those villagers from going to the office. They might harass them, even threaten them, in some cases use violence against them. And in many cases, the authorities that are accepting the petition just say, okay, great, thank you. Now we're going to file it over here. We'll get to it when we can get to it. Or just say, sorry, there's not much that we can do here. Sometimes that's kind of the end of it, but oftentimes if the people are persistent and continue to be sufficiently aggrieved, they'll petition to higher levels. And as their frustration level gets higher, that's when you often see things spill into street level protests. Now, the local authorities really don't want higher level authorities to find out about any of this. So all the while they're doing their best to kind of make sure that higher level authorities don't find out. And it's only when higher level authorities find out that maybe they would intervene. So a lot is going on sort of beneath the without higher level authorities being aware of, what's happening in each of these tens of thousands of protests. So when higher level authorities do intervene, they don't always intervene, but when they do, a typical response would be to say, okay, well, let's punish the leaders of the protest because they're causing trouble, but maybe we'll fire the village leader or transfer the village leader. Maybe we'll force the village leaders to give some sort of compensation or address some part of the demands of the villagers and hope that things sort of end there. So it's a mixed response. Are the villagers really satisfied? In some ways, they got what they wanted, but in other ways, they were repressed. Now, meanwhile, though, the system as a whole is keeping track of all of these petitions that are being lodged. And, it's one thing the Chinese government's good at is, collecting data and writing up reports. Sometimes the on the ground data isn't accurate, but that's one of the purposes of the entire letters and visit system, to find out what are the major grievances. And when the same grievance keeps coming up in protest after protest, then higher level authorities have, in numerous cases, changed policy in response. That's how local level taxes in the countryside ended up being eradicated, for example. So that was kind of a long-winded answer, but I hope it kind of got at your question about this mixed nature of the response.
Yeah, the point is, of course, that local officials, the last thing they want is news of dissatisfaction percolating up. And so if they can, perhaps they try to address it. But as you suggest, sometimes it's the local officials themselves who are being criticized for having, being suspected of participating in a land grab, doing something else that they ought not do. And so we can see the levers of the system in that respect. One of the other things that you mentioned was the use of law and appealing to the law. And this is something Mary Gallagher has written about with regard to labor cases, where workers, where the factory boss absconded and didn't pay them, or did something else, where workers have been able to go to court. They haven't always won, but in going to court, they haven't had to blockade the street or seize the factory or take that factory manager hostage, that sort of thing. But could you talk a little bit more about the strategic use of the law and the strategic use of the language of the day, of the ideological context in which this happens? If you have, for example, poverty eradication being promoted, or if you have anti-corruption being one of the big themes of the day, maybe you could say something about the strategic use by ordinary Chinese of both the law and the words of the leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. And this, you're well aware of it. I don't know if everyone in the audience is well aware of it, but this kind of phenomenon of pointing to the leaders' words and policies and laws and saying that lower level authorities are not following these has been coined rightful resistance by Lian Jiangli and Kevin O'Brien. And I think it really, captured everyone's attention when they coined this phrase, because it's a great way of understanding the dynamics, again, of type 1 protest only. So this is a way that individual citizens and groups of citizens are strategic in how they frame their demands, often using the words of top party leaders or policies and holding lower level leaders accountable. And in fact, there are some very interesting studies of villagers. And in a case where, say, it's a problem with the land, but it also involves environmental degradation, there's sort of a casting about, okay, what is the campaign of the day at the national level, or what's being talked about? And if you can kind of hook onto that, maybe it's anti-corruption, maybe it's poverty eradication, maybe it's environmental degradation. And if you can frame your protest demands in the language of the regime, then you have a much better chance of gaining a sympathetic response from the regime. And so I think that's a really important point, because I know, at least for my students, the general impression is, China has this horrible Orwellian totalitarian regime. You can't even peek your head out of the house without the Chinese Communist Party knowing what you're doing and listening to every conversation. And people are afraid and obedient. But really, the Chinese citizenry is quite savvy and uses the language of the regime against the regime, saying, okay, you are claiming to be benevolent leaders. Let's live up to that language.
Thank you. And we're getting some great questions from the audience. I want to remind people that you're welcome to submit questions using that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we're going to turn to those questions in just a second, but I want to go back to where you left off. And that's the question of omnipresence, because that is a common impression that people have, that the Chinese state is everywhere all the time. And certainly there are messages sometimes from the state suggesting we are there everywhere all the time, that sort of thing. But in fact, how has the new media environment, social media is not new anymore in China, but it was, we used to see Weibo, for example, as a way for the Chinese state to kind of keep an eye on where, what was causing people pain? Why were some disgruntled? Where were they? What was going on? Not for the purposes of repression, but for the purposes of information gathering. What is happening now with regard to social media and both its use and perhaps its abuse by the state?
Well, again, I would point you to that elephant picture. There is a lot of repression, but there's also a lot of free expression through intercommunication technology. So yes, there definitely is evidence that under Xi Jinping, there have been greater attempts to constrict the free flow of information, including somebody videoing and posting a protest or some malfeasance on the part of a government official. But at the same time, it's really a giant cat and mouse game. And I really like China Digital Times. I'm sure some people here look at it, but they keep kind of a running track of the different memes and words and pictures that are censored. And then, of course, the minute one thing is censored, a new kind of homonym or image that evokes the same idea is created. So, it's a cat and mouse game. Every time the regime tries to constrict and repress the free flow of information, there's somebody, or cat and mouse. You could also use whack-a-mole as an analogy for that. And some things on the internet are hard to wipe off. Once something is posted, and there have been many cases where protesters have heard about, or aggrieved citizens, I should say, have heard about protests on a similar subject in another locality. And they say, look at what they did, maybe mimicking the tactics, maybe using the same kind of language. So even while the regime is trying to constrict the free flow of information at the same time, it can't constrict all of it. And there's some evidence that the regime doesn't want to completely restrict the free flow of information because it is a valuable information source. So, it might not be satisfying for me not to give a real kind of simple cut and dry answer, but I really do think it's a complex situation.
Yeah, it's not one thing, all the time. And one of the points I think that you were making is there have been occasions where there's been a tremendous outpouring, such as when Dr. Li, the ophthalmologist in Wuhan, passed away, and people were outraged that his efforts to draw attention to the COVID-19 outbreak were suppressed, and that he was chastised for having done that. He was seen as a hero to the people, and the state stood aside during a lot of that. And so sometimes social media can act as a release valve for some of this, in addition to a way that somebody might learn, well, this is how they did it in Anhui. This is, maybe a tactic we could use. I'd like to turn to some of the questions that we're getting from the audience. And Manfred Elstrom, somebody who and is known to us at USC. He was here at USC working on labor. And one of the things that he's looking at is this type 1, type 2. Before we get to Manfred's specific question, though, I would like to ask you about your type 2 designation, because oftentimes it's interesting, the Chinese central government wants to present discontent in Xinjiang, discontent in Tibet, discontent in Hong Kong as an issue of material well-being, as an issue of the high price of housing, the limited economic opportunities, something like that. And so that's a situation where the protesters are making political demands, and the government's responding, saying, don't talk about politics, let's talk about the economics of it. And I was wondering if you could respond to that for a moment.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. It's possible to think, what if certainly some of the grievances that have been driving the Hong Kong protests are material, and in the case of Xinjiang and Tibet and Hong Kong, part of the complaints have emanated at least from the influx of Han Chinese, who are, kind of, that has economic repercussions in the area that the local population does not feel that they're benefiting from. So I think in some ways the central authorities, it's kind of the central authorities say, well, look at all for Xinjiang and Tibet. We'll say, look at all we've done for you in terms of infrastructure and poverty alleviation, and your incomes have improved, your standard of living has improved. But that kind of first, people in those areas, I think, certainly recognize those gains, but it's not what the source of their concerns are. In Hong Kong, if the protesters had not said anything about democracy, but instead had just focused on material concerns, like the influx of Han Chinese or high housing prices, or, the availability of higher education, I don't know, maybe the regime would have responded in a more sympathetic way.
Yeah, I don't want to suggest the counterfactual. People took to the streets with the signs that they had, demanding, greater control over their own lives, those sorts of things. But it's striking that the government wants to frame the source of discontent quite differently from where the protesters start. And that's an important dynamic. Now, Manfred asks a couple of questions here. One is, he's saying, if Tibetans and Uyghurs take to the streets or make demands, sometimes those demands might be about economic concerns. It might be about enforcement of various standards, those sorts of things, not the political questions, not the ethnic autonomy, not the protection of culture, those sorts of things. But he asks, are they treated differently because of who they are? Because they are Uyghur, they are Tibetan.
Well, I think the best example of the potential for, say, an ethnic minority in an autonomous region to make more material claims and be treated more sympathetically is in Inner Mongolia. So in that case, we have seen protests that have had kind of both features, but when they have been more focused on material concerns like land and environmental degradation, they generally have been treated more like type 1 protests. So I would say that's a good kind of case where we can try to answer that question. The last question, I'm just looking now at Manfred's question.
Well, his second question is, are type 1 protests not in Xinjiang, not in Tibet, not in Hong Kong, now being treated as political protests in the same way that your type 2 protests are treated?
Yes, I think increasingly so. And again, I would stress increasingly. I wouldn't say that they're all being treated as type 2 protests, but absolutely we are seeing a trend in that direction. And, I say this often, if I don't get why Xi Jinping and the top authorities are doing this. To me, it seems counterproductive, because allowing for the type 1 protests and trying to address those grievances has been a very effective way of shoring up regime legitimacy. And it's a lot easier to maintain Communist Party power when the populace supports you than when they don't, because when they don't, then you have to engage in repression and you run the risk of the whole system crashing down.
And so since you've said, I don't understand why they're doing it, I'm not going to ask for you to explain why opting for, kind of elevating every dispute to the political realm, to the regime challenge realm. Doesn't that, in fact, up the stakes and make every potential dispute a threat, to social stability?
Yeah, I think it has the potential to do so. And, my specialty is not in analyzing, kind of poking inside the brains of chopped Chinese Communist Party leaders. But it is somewhat puzzling to me. I mean, we can go back to kind of Xi Jinping's background. I recently heard Elizabeth Perry say that, he and many of the current top Chinese Communist Party leaders did not have the same kind of higher education that the earlier leaders in the reform era did, and that perhaps they're just less open to kind of a plurality of ideas. That's one explanation. But I do not think it is serving the regime well.
And how much of this is just at the top? Or in fact, has Chinese officialdom changed?
Well, I think Chinese officialdom responds to the changing incentive structure. So if they're being evaluated on maintaining social stability in their locality as one of the criteria, then you can see this kind of going in both ways. One is we want to suppress any unrest because we don't want to look bad, but it could also go the other way. We want to make people happy in our locality so that they don't want to protest in the first place. But really, I think Chinese officialdom responds to the changing incentive structure as it is set down by higher level authorities.
Yeah, it's a Leninist party. And so, there is that expectation of discipline carrying these things out. And as you say, the incentives, the rewards are very clear, and the punishments also very clear, especially in this, anti-corruption era. So we've seen that. So for a final, really unfair pairing of questions, so I want to go ahead and admit to that up front. One of our audience members is asking you to look back to the age of Mao. And so, what is the legacy of the Mao era? And I don't know in particular what the questioner is referring to. It could be the Cultural Revolution. It could be, the notion of land reform and these kinds of things. But what is the legacy of Mao? And then we have someone else who says, stop talking about the past. Talk about now. Well, I want to understand how the people have responded to the COVID crisis.
Okay, well, we'll start with the past, the impact of China's revolutionary history. Well, it is right to rebel, right? So that is, embedded in the history and the practice of the Chinese Communist Party. So certainly anyone who came of age during the Maoist period, including Xi Jinping, heard those words. And the Maoist era was a time in some respects that you might call mass democracy, or at least mass mobilization. So this is kind of baked into the political culture in the People's Republic of China. And in this sense, the more that Xi Jinping kind of ties himself back to the Maoist legacy, he runs that risk of kind of legitimizing this kind of popular collective activism. And at the same time, the Chinese Communist Party still calls itself the Chinese Communist Party. And when you listen to these lengthy speeches, there's still all of this phrasing, right? Socialism with Chinese characteristics. And, some of the phraseology has been abandoned, especially under Xi Jinping. But still, this is the claim to the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy. So this gives workers and farmers the ability to use the legitimating principles and the language of the regime to hold the regime accountable. So I absolutely think that has an impact on today. The response of the Chinese public to the COVID crisis? Well, first of all, I'll admit I haven't been able to get back to China during the COVID crisis, so I haven't been able to kind of be on the ground and observe. So there may be others here who have had that ability who could speak from a slightly different perspective. But I do think it's important here to also remember that the contrast between the Chinese government's response, which absolutely lots of regular people on the ground had criticisms about, you already referenced some of that, and it was incredibly harsh and authoritarian, but China did return to a version of life as normal much more quickly than did most Western democracies. So I think that's the other piece of the puzzle, is that it's not just the regime itself doing things to shore up its own legitimacy. In order for people to want an alternative to Chinese Communist Party rule, there has to be a viable and appealing alternative that exists. But currently, there really isn't one. I don't think many people in China would say, well, let's just have a democracy like you have in America, or the type of political system that they have in Western Europe. Those systems did not deal as well with at least getting life back somewhat to normal in response to the COVID crisis, or for that matter, the 2008 economic crisis. So, again, I can't really speak from personal observations on the ground in China about people's responses to the government's handling of the COVID crisis, but I would point to this very important factor of the lack of a viable and appealing alternative to Chinese Communist Party rule.
Thank you. That was a great summation. And we probably should end it here, but if I might have one last question. And this goes back to 1989 and also to 2021. The question is, what really seems to concern Beijing is when folks get out of their lane. So when students travel somewhere in China to support strikers, or when workers support taxi drivers, or homeowners come out to support environmental activists, that sort of thing. When you get this cross-sectoral mixing. And I was wondering if you might give us a picture of, is that why some responses are more total? Because, for example, the protests in Hong Kong, the protests in Xinjiang, the protests in Tibet are often of that sort, where it's a neighborhood, it's a community, as opposed to people who work at a particular factory.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. That kind of crosses the line where top regime authorities might see it as threatening to the system in a different way than that a typical type 1 protest is not. And I think one example that's a much smaller example is homeowner protests, the wealthy homeowner protests. They tended to be pretty successful in getting their demands met. And there have even been cases where they almost have acted like lobbyists, like we see in Western political systems, getting policies kind of tweaked in the direction that they would like to see. But maybe 6 or 7 years ago, some of these homeowner associations and activist groups in different cities started to connect with one another. And that's when the line was crossed. And they weren't thrown in jail or anything like that, but that was the end to their progress. And they ended up, it didn't really go any further than that. So yeah, I would say there's There's always a fuzzy boundary between, what I call type 1 and type 2. And there again, I refer back to my elephant. Anytime anybody makes a simplistic generalization about China or any political regime, you should raise an eyebrow. So even with the type 1 and type 2, those are, sort of ideal types or general categories. And absolutely, there are many cases where the boundaries between the two are fuzzy, or over the course of time, because of a change in higher level Communist Party leadership, or a change in the demands or the tactics of the protesters themselves, that line becomes much more blurry.
And trying to make sense of this elephant. And if you are, a protester, not knowing necessarily where the line is, and how willing are you to take another step to find out if you're still on the right side of the line. So there's a lot at play. We could have talked about a lot more, protests on the part of women's groups, legal protests, legal rights, these kinds of things, as well as many others. But you've given us this great view of the state of play in China today. And for that, we're really grateful, Professor Wright. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And if anybody has further questions, I'd welcome you to email me. I'm pretty easy to find at Cal State Long Beach, Political Science.
So take advantage, friends, and reach out to Professor Wright with your questions, with your comments. We've posted links to her books in the chat. Hopefully you've taken advantage of that. And also at our website, we have a biographical note about her that you can click on to access her webpage at Cal State Long Beach and take advantage of that. We are grateful to all of you for joining us this afternoon. We hope that you'll join us in the future for our upcoming event focusing on Panda Nation, but also take advantage of the resources on our website, and please encourage your friends to get on our newsletter. Everybody can do these things. Go to china.usc.edu. Thank you all for being with us. We look forward to seeing you again. Take care.